Want to make a fantasy world? Great! The magic and mystery are at your command while shaping a fantastic world full of exotic wonders. Yet who will live in this marvelous fantasy world? Why, we need to make some fantasy races. But there's so many wonderful fantasy races and numerous stories across many different mediums. How do we stand out from the crowd? By ripping off J.R.R. Tolkien, of course! Now some of you may think that the genre of fantasy is an excuse to free one's imagination to create truly alien and bizarre races. But that is utterly wrong. Fantasy is all about being derivative and not getting out of your comfort zone. It is very important that the genre of fantasy remains sternly under the shadow of Tolkien and make no attempts to push the boundaries in any way. We do this by copying Tolkien's fantasy races while making sure to completely miss the point of Tolkien's themes. And, of course, never should we actually bother to read the original mythologies that inspired Tolkien to create his works. No one uses primary sources who wants to be taken seriously, just copy and paste. Let's get started. The first race we want to add into our fantasy world is elves. Tolkien's elves had a sordid and violent past. However, we have only watched the movies, so let's make our elves just like that. Ethereal, beautiful, and impossibly smug. In fact, we can apply many of the lessons of making a perfect protagonist to the elves. Make sure they are flawless in every way. I'm sure their ageless wisdom will come across as endearing rather than condescending. Be sure they use their heritage as an excuse to lord over the other races. I can't see any historical parallels at all. So now that we have our eternal and perfect elves, what do we do next? Why, we add more of them. If readers like one race of smug, pretentious, and lecturing immortals who are always right, then they will love to have a whole bunch more. Want to preach about environmentalism? Use wood elves and make them tree-hugging hippies. Want to make your elves edgy? Send them through a goth phase and add dark elves. Why stop there? Keep adding new elven races until there isn't any room, or until we run out of ideas. Speaking of running out of ideas, dwarves are the easiest fantasy race. Just copy them directly from Tolkien without changing a single trait. We may need to give them a Scottish accent to save time rather than creating a whole distinctive language. Need a source of steampunk technology? Dwarves will be the go-to origin of any mechanical devices within the setting. But don't bother to explain why they haven't used their technological edge to conquer all of the other races. Make sure they stay within their underground halls, not having anything to do with the plot. But don't leave them out either. We can't deviate from the theme of ripping off Tolkien. Next, we will add in orcs. Remember to make the orcs' nature fundamentally evil. Some may find the moral and philosophical implications of a race that is inherently evil to be rather problematic, as it brings up deep questions about the nature of evil, as well as call into question the influence of society and culture upon its members. This presents troubling conundrums, like, would an orc be evil if he was raised in an environment that taught kindness and mercy while renouncing violence? If evil only destroys, then how can it create a race at all? If the orcs were once elves twisted into darkness, then could it be possible for them to find redemption under the right circumstances? How would a society that is utterly evil and dedicated to destruction even function? Tolkien himself struggled with these very questions, which is why we are going to completely ignore them. Now let's look at halflings. Ditch them. You heard me. Remember what I said earlier about ripping off Tolkien? Well, here is where we ignore that rule and completely remove halflings. Halflings are boring, and they will have no place in our fantasy plot, since our conflict with the Dark Lord will be resolved in a one-on-one duel with a teenager who is secretly the heir to the human kingdom. We can't have meek, ordinary folk actually rise to the occasion and selflessly risk their happy lives to save the world. After all, average people can't accomplish anything, and the fantasy genre certainly wouldn't waste time pandering to those people, now would it? Why would they need an escapist fantasy? Now we have all the fantasy races we need to populate our very original and creative fantasy world. Some might worry that we stray into unfortunate implications by creating races who have specific abilities, especially when we say that some races, like, say, blonde-haired, blue-eyed elves, are better than others. But don't worry, no one calls anyone else a racist on the internet.